So our last speaker, I'm conscious of the time as well, but I would very much like to hear from our last speaker, who is Dr. now, SHIVA NOURPANAH, recent Dr. SHIVA NOURPANAH. SHIVA joined the Transition House Association of Nova Scotia as the provincial coordinator in April 2018. She's been conducting research and teaching at a local university since 2008 when she immigrated to Canada from Iran. Her areas of research include the experience of refugees and temporary migrants. Formerly, she worked for 8 years in Iran as a staff member of the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. She's published work on the ethics of refugee aid, women's human rights in refugee aid, and the experiences of settlement and integration of Afghan refugees in Halifax. Currently, she is researching the role of sexual and gender-based violence in refugee claims, and she's been a member of the board of directors of the Halifax Refugee Clinic since 2011. So thank you, SHIVA.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for your patience and your time. I'll try and make this short, and because I really think actually the three presenters before me said a lot of what needs to be said. I just want to focus on some conclusions. Also, this is the first time that I'm presenting where people whom I've interviewed are sitting there too, so that makes it kind of weird for me, but I'll do my best. So one of the main points that we're trying to, that we uncovered through this research was that the way it's conceptualized, sexual gender-based violence, the way it's conceptualized, and the way, for example, through the case studies that Constance was talking about, is that it's something terrible that happens in the country of origin. The woman flees and then she arrives at a safe country, which is safe. And I think what a part of the contribution that Evie and my research is doing, our research is doing, is to show how sexual gender-based violence continues to impact the claimant even after their arrival in a country of refuge. And it affects on multiple dimensions, legally, socially, and personally. So apart from the case analysis that we've been doing at Halifax Refugee Clinic, we've also been conducting interviews with staff members to get their experience of handling, of dealing with these cases, as well as trying to interview some people who have refugee claimants and now recognized refugees here who have undergone sexual and gender-based violence. These are some of the common themes which are emerging from the interviews. We're noticing, it's very noticeable, the legal gaps which exist. Constance has already mentioned, has talked about how gender isn't a convention ground. We note the lack of social supports for claimants, and also noticeably, we note the lack of support for people who work with refugees, with survivors, that they basically have no form of social, mental health care support in doing the important work that they do. So here I have some quotes from the interviews that we were conducting, which were very telling, and they talk to the difficulty of trying to present these cases which are based on this very compelling ground, which is not actually recognized in the Convention for Refugee Protection. And the first quote is from a lawyer who works with who used to work with refugee cases, where she's quite frank, saying that describing just how hard it is to present a case convincingly based on sexual gender-based violence, and again the recommendation pointing out to, and I think some of Constance's narrative analysis showed that, how arbitrary and random the application of gender guidelines is. It seems to be something which board members, people who make decisions on refugee claims, they either choose to or choose not to apply. It's not something that they are actually compelled to take seriously. The other thing that was noticed, of course, was the lack of social supports for claimants. And again, here, and I also want to tell you a story which really stayed with me from an interview that I had with a refugee claimant. So She arrived here in Canada and she was guided through the refugee clinic to stay at a shelter for youth, a homeless shelter. And this was a woman who had experienced family violence in her family home. So part of the policy of the shelter, which she understood, was that they would open doors throughout the night to ensure that the youth whom they were sheltering at the place were okay, they hadn't overdosed, or they were doing well, they were alive. But this young woman who had experienced family violence in her home, she was traumatized by the sound of the door opening at night. So for the first, and this would go on throughout the night, and she also had very poor, she had no language skill, no English. So for the first 2 weeks at the shelter, she couldn't basically sleep, because throughout the night, like 2 or 3 times throughout the night, the door would open, they would do the nightly check to make sure she's alive, and each time she would have a kind of panic attack and these are very subtle, very minute, but at the same time very shocking and very striking examples of how this sexual and gender-based violence that women experience just continue to haunt them, and they're very they occur in such subtle, finely grained that nobody ever thinks of it. Nobody, until it's actually articulated in a different context, and it's like, all right, so how do we deal with this now? Then there's these policies which don't quite, which are sometimes in complete disarray or in complete contradiction to and exacerbate, as in fact has been also talked about by Evie. There's these policies and practices which exacerbate the effects of sexual gender-based violence. And the third thing which is emerging from our interviews is how it affects staff not just here, but around the world. We have like a cohort of people who work with refugee issues. Certainly I can talk to that, and I can talk to the recommended guideline. When I was working with UNHCR was to work for 2 years with to that kind of hard field work, and most people just end up doing it forever because that's what they know and that's what they enjoy doing. And it is, people feel responsible for the outcome of those files, and it is a heavy spirit. It does weigh heavy, and there isn't a lot of support out there. So finally, to wrap up, what we point to is the gaps in the legal framework, both in the policies and in the practices of interpretation and implementation of the Convention. In many cases, they might lead to actual violation of the Convention, to the extent that not only do they not protect refugees, but they actually aggravate the vulnerability and perpetuate that sexual gender-based violence. And we also see continued gaps in the social supports, capacities, and resources in the host countries. So thank you very much for your patience. We hope that there will be some good questions and discussion. Thank you.